Welcome to Restoration. I'm Rabbi Matt. So glad you could join us for this online Shabbat gathering. You know, the high holidays are soon upon us, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Sukkot. And we have some special services that we've put together that will be posted on our Restoration app and shalomseattle.com and Facebook and YouTube for you to follow along and celebrate these wonderful holidays with us. They will be posted the night of sundown of the night of each of the holidays on Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, the first day of Sukkot, and the 8th day of Sukkot. And we want to encourage you to take these times, take these services, and use them with your family to celebrate the holiday together. We don't have digital apples and honey to give you, but you can have your own apples and honey, and we will show you what to do. We're also going to have the virtual Zoom shofar blasts, and it's just, we're going to have as much fun as we can have in the middle of a pandemic, which, you know, I'm the happy rabbi, so we're going to have a lot of fun. And we want to encourage you to have fun with us. We're supported by tithes and offerings, and you can give on the Restoration app, also on shalomseattle.com. If you're a member or regular attender of Restoration, we encourage you to do that. If you're part of a local congregation somewhere else, we want to encourage you to tithe and give there. But if you want to bless us, as we've been a blessing to you, we certainly welcome that as well. We also have a Helping Others Fund, and we've had the joy of being able to give money for different needs in people in our community here in Seattle. And if that's something you'd like to do in this crazy season for so many people, you can use the drop-down menu for Helping Others, and we'll make sure that money goes to people here in Seattle and in our community that need help through this pandemic. We're in the middle of a series called Hearing and Doing. And it's all about the Shema and the Vahavta from Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 5 to 9. And we're going to continue that series today. And throughout these 8 messages, which are actually going to take us to the end of Sukkot, so through our holidays, we're focusing on the basics of hearing and doing and what that means for the people of God. And as part of that, Shauna, our worship leader, put together the songs of the Shema and the Ve'ahavta. Now, some of you are going to hear it and go, didn't they play those songs last week? Yes, we did. And we're going to play them actually for today and for the next 6. And if some of you are like, but that's so repetitious, welcome to Judaism. That's how things work. It's the repetition of the meditation on these things that the more we read them and the more we meditate on them and the more we understand them, the more they find their ways into our hearts and our minds and our souls so that we can love the Lord our God with all our heart, with all our soul, and with all our strength. So we're going to sing together the Shema and the Ve'ahavta with Shauna, and then we're going to come back and continue this series on hearing and doing.
Shema Yisrael and earth will shake at the sound of your name. The Lord our God, oh, the Lord is one. Heaven and earth will shake at the sound of your name. The Lord our God, oh, the Lord is one. Heaven and earth will shake at the sound of your name. The Lord our God, oh, the Lord is one. Heaven and earth will shake at the sound of your name. The Lord our God, oh, the Lord is one. Heaven and earth will shake at the sound of your name. The Lord our God, oh, the Lord is one. Oh, the Lord is one. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Et Adonai Elohecha b'kol avecha ub'kol nafshecha ub'kol me'odecha. Et Adonai Elohecha b'kol avecha ub'kol nafshecha ub'kol me'odecha.
Today is the second message in the series called Hearing and Doing, where we're taking the words of the Shema and the Ve'ahavta and breaking it down into 8 words that are found in those verses. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4, starting in verse 4 says, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love Adonai your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. These words, which I'm commanding you today, are to be on your heart. You're to teach them diligently to your children and speak of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes, and write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. So in the first message, if you missed it, you can go back and watch it on the Restoration app or YouTube and Facebook, is on the word Shema, and it's typically translated hear or listen. But we talked about last week was that the word Shema means hearing and doing, because in ancient Israel, there's no word, in ancient Hebrew, there is no word for obey. It's just Shema, hear and obey, hear and do. So the second word that we're going to focus on today is the word Israel. Hear, O Israel. It's a part of asking, who is God actually speaking to through Moses in Deuteronomy? And the simple answer is Israel equals the Jewish people. And the Jewish people are the physical descendants of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob. Now, there's all kinds of people who claim all kinds. If you ask several Jewish people, what is a Jew? You're going to get lots of different answers. But generally, there's agreement on the idea that somebody is Jewish who has at least one parent or one grandparent who is Jewish, or not even necessarily grew up Jewish, but understands that they have Jewish ancestry. And it's those people, the physical descendants of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and the 12 tribes of Israel, that God made a covenant with at Mount Sinai. We talked about last week that the whole book of Deuteronomy is totally unnecessary. And it's unnecessary because God gave us everything we needed in Genesis, Exodus, and Leviticus to send us into the promised land, but we didn't trust him with the 12 spies who went into the land and came back, 10 of them with an evil report. And so they had to walk around the wilderness for 40 years, the book of Numbers, until everyone in that generation died. And then when we got to the edge of the wilderness and the promised land, Moses spoke to Joshua and Caleb, who were the only ones that represented their generation, and then their children and their children's children, many of whom were born in the wilderness during those 40 years. And so the whole book of Deuteronomy is really Moses' sermon that he's preaching to the children of Israel before they go in. And he's saying, remember these things. I know you're going to forget them because you even forgot them when we were there in the wilderness. And when I went up to get the commandments and I came down, you already had a golden calf and the whole thing was ridiculous. And you've already failed like several times in the wilderness and you're probably going to fail more. But if you could just keep coming back to these words, hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. It's a reminder to us to come back to these things and the covenant that God made with the Jewish people, and one of many covenants that he made with the Jewish people. In fact, the new covenant in the New Testament also was made with the Jewish people first and then extended to the nations. In fact, all the covenants that God made with any people were always with Israel first, so that we could be, what the prophet Isaiah says about 35 times, a light to the nations. That the Jewish people would bear the responsibility to be a light to the nations. And so we come to really Deuteronomy 26, verses 16 to 19, is the clearest, most concise few verses that explain the covenant that God made with the children of Israel through Moses. It says in Deuteronomy 26, verse 16, this day Adonai your God is commanding you to do these statutes and ordinances so that you are to take care and do them with all your heart, with all of your soul. Today you've affirmed Adonai as your God, that you will walk in his ways, keep his statutes, his mitzvot, and ordinances, and listen to his voice. Now today, Adonai has affirmed you as his treasured people, and he has promised you that you are to keep all of his commandments, and that he will set you high above all the nations that he has made for praise and fame and honor, and that you're to be a holy people to Adonai your God, as he has promised. And then in the book of Exodus, back in the Exodus itself, in chapter 4 and verse 22, as Moses is convincing Pharaoh to let his people go, this is what God tells Moses to say. Exodus chapter 4, verse 22, you're to say to Pharaoh, this is what Adonai says, Israel is my son, my firstborn. So I have said to you, let my son go that he may serve me, but you've refused to let him go. So I'm going to kill your son, your firstborn. There's places all through the scripture where this comes up, particularly in the prophets like Jeremiah and Isaiah, where God, through the prophets, confirm this idea that Israel is God's firstborn son. And what that means is there's an inheritance that comes with being the firstborn son. And in ancient Israel, the inheritance was different than how we understand inheritance in our time. When somebody dies and there's a will and the inheritance is split up to all the people of the will, kind of everybody gets their financial piece, or somebody gets too big of a financial piece and everybody gets mad at them and then they sue them, or people argue over the money or the house or the stuff. But in ancient Israel, in a nomadic society, the reason why the firstborn gets an inheritance is not for himself. It is for him to, as the father of the house, when his father dies, to take care of everyone in his house. And it's with that in mind that God refers to Israel as his firstborn son. And part of Israel being God's firstborn son is a responsibility to tell the nations, to be a light to the nations, to tell the nations that there's no other God but the God of Israel, that the gods you worship are no gods at all, that hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. There's only one God. And it's our responsibility as a Jewish people to tell the whole world that there's only one God, and that Gentiles can worship that one God too. It's found actually in the covenant that God makes with Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, verse 1. It says, "And Adonai said to Abram," which, by the way, Abram means father, and his name is later changed to Abraham as father of many nations, as part of the calling on him and his descendants that extends beyond the children of Israel, but starts with his physical descendants. "Then Adonai said to Abram, get going out of your land and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land that I will show you. My heart's desire is to make you into a great nation, to bless you, to make your name great, so that you may be a blessing. And my desire is to bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And in you, all the families of the earth will be blessed." And this idea of blessing that is for all the nations of the earth starts with the children of Israel, but the idea of the blessing is because as God's firstborn son, we are then responsible to share the blessing that God gives to us, the inheritance that he gives to us, with everyone from every nation, to call them in not to become Jewish people themselves, but as people from the nations, the Gentiles, because many of you know I say often in my messages, Gentile is not a bad word in the scriptures. It literally just means nations. You're from all the nations that are not Israel. And Abram was taken out of the nations and separated as a people so that his physical descendants would be a blessing to the earth. I can't tell you how many times I meet Christians, or I get emails or phone calls of people that just want to know, can you just tell me how Jesus fulfills the holidays? Could you just tell me a little bit about the fulfillment? Because I don't really think the holidays matter, but if Jesus has something to do with the holidays, then I want to know that part. And it doesn't really work that way. Jesus didn't celebrate the holidays on his time on earth just to fulfill them. He celebrated them as part of the covenant that he made with the Jewish people. If you go back forward into the writings of Paul says in Colossians that Yeshua is the visible image of the invisible God. And in theology, we talk about this idea, and we're going to talk about this when we get to the word one in the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, what one echad really means, and how that actually plays out in the scriptures. But Yeshua is the visible image of the invisible God, meaning when Yud-He Vav-He, which is the name of God, which is next week's sermon, shows up and has conversations with Abraham and wrestles Jacob and shows up in different places. The scripture says that when Moses got up to the mountain, the cloud descended onto Moses and he spoke with God face to face. And for us, that means he speaking to Yeshua. He's speaking to Jesus face to face. And Yeshua is the one who is making the covenant. Part of the reason why Yeshua keeps the holidays on the 33 years of his life is because he's a part of the Jewish people. And there's a blessing, even beyond just the blessing of Yeshua himself. There's a blessing to the nations that comes from the inheritance that God has given the Jewish people. I mean, how ridiculous is it that in a 4,000-year history, we have never exceeded the number 16 million? In a world currently that has over 7 billion people in a population, that there's a disproportionate amount of blessing that comes from the Jewish people to 16 million Jewish people, to all the rest of humanity in the world. There's all kinds of things that different writings and articles and books that you can look at that help you understand that the Jewish people have only survived all the way back to the covenants that he made with us, only survived by God's grace and for God's glory. Even when Moses says to Pharaoh, you have to let my people go. Well, why? Why would I let your people go? And the answer is to worship me in the wilderness. We have to go worship God. That's our life. That's our responsibility. God himself is our inheritance. Even to the point where the tribe of Levi, who become the priesthood, don't even get land. Their inheritance is being the priesthood. Their inheritance is to be a priesthood to the other 11 tribes. And in the same way, the Jewish people are called to be a priesthood to the nations. That we are to bring God to the nations. But even among Jewish people who don't believe in God, there's still an aspect of blessing that God puts on the Jewish people. And it's this double-sided coin of blessing, which on the flip side, for other people who hate Jewish people, for whatever reason, people hate people, they use the very same things that God blessed us with to attack us as why are they so special? And the answer is we're not. The only thing that makes us special is that God separated us to be a blessing to the nations. Adam Taylor writes in an article in the Washington Post just about global Jewish populations before and after the Holocaust. And he says, in 1939, before the Holocaust, the global population of the Jewish people worldwide peaked at around 16.6 million people, which I would venture to say from this information is the most Jewish people there's ever been on the planet at once. 16.6 million. And that population was decimated by the Holocaust, which saw Nazi Germany and its collaborators kill approximately 6 million Jews. And in just a few horrifying years, the global population of the Jewish people fell by more than a third. To the point now where in an article from just this April in the Australian Jewish News, I don't know how big their circulation is, but they're on the internet. The Australian Jewish News, it says Israel has 6.7 million Jews, which makes up 45% of the world total of Jewish people. Another 5.2 million Jews were born in the country, while about 1 million are natives of either Europe or the Americas. The United States has the second largest Jewish population with 5.7 million, followed by France at 450,000 and Canada at 392,000. The United Kingdom has 292,000. Argentina has 180. Russia has 165,000. Germany has 118,000. Australia has 116,000. And in 1948, on the eve of the establishment of the State of Israel, the number of Jews in the world was 5.1 million, according to one report. Also on the eve of the Holocaust, Israel's Ministry of Finances reported that there are 189,500 Holocaust survivors living in Israel, with some 31,000 over the age of 90 and more than 800 over 100 years old. In the past year, some 15,000 survivors of the Holocaust have died. With all of that crazy numbers, from 16.6 million before the Holocaust, we are now somewhere around 14.7 million in world population. How does the Jewish population get decimated in a horrific genocide that only 70 years later gets back to almost the same number? And why over the course of history have the Jewish people always made contributions to everywhere we've been for 4,000 years? In George Gilder's book, The Israel Test, he says this, that you have to understand that Jewish people are 0.3% of world population. But interestingly, he writes, they have contributed some 25% of recent notable human intellectual accomplishment in the modern period. Jews have 14% of the Nobel Prizes in literature, chemistry, physics, medicine, and physiology. In the second half of the 21st century, when Nobel Prizes began to be awarded everywhere, all over the world, that percentage rose to 29%. And so far in the 21st century, it's 32% of all Nobel Prizes go to Jewish people for innovations in all kinds of things. I mean, it turns out we're pretty funny too. And we're directors and filmmakers and artists and comedians and some of the greatest music that's ever been written and some of the greatest movies ever made and some of the greatest artwork and all of these different things. It's entirely disproportionate to the size of the Jewish people in the history of our people, which is at least 4,000 years old. From Moses to Sandy Koufax, just kidding. It's 4,000 years of Jewish history and suffering that comes for the Jewish people in much of those 4,000 years where we've been murdered and kicked out and sent away from every country in Europe at some point in the last 2,000 years. And there's been genocides and pogroms and holocausts and all of these things, and yet we're still here. And the simple question is, why? And the answer is, because God made a promise. And the promise was not, if you fail, I will leave you. The promise is, when you don't listen to what I told you and you forget the things that I said, I'm still going to bless you. And I'm still going to call you back to myself. And I'm still going to put in your hearts and in your minds the ability to create wonderful things that will bless the world, going all the way back to the covenant that God made with Abraham. In you, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. And yet we find the modern state of Israel is one of the most hated countries in the world. And the Jewish people, by proxy, find ourselves hated everywhere we go. Even though we've made all of these contributions to the world and to science and math and entertainment and business and finance and every area of education and creativity, and somehow even in the church and among people who claim to be followers of Jesus, there are seeds of anti-Semitism that are so old that go back to about 50 years even after the death of the last apostle, which is John in 95, that people in their minds somehow separate John and James and Peter and Paul and even Jesus from the Jewish people, as if they were part of something totally brand new that was separate from something that happened in the land of Israel while they spoke Hebrew, that happened in interaction with all the holidays that we celebrate. They all celebrated and they all ate kosher and they all lived as Jewish people. But it was soon after their deaths that some who are known as church fathers started to create kind of theologies and ideas around the hatred of Jewish people that finds itself, look, most Christians don't hate Jewish people. I know that, and you know that. But what people don't realize is that some of the theology they hold and some of the things that they believe are rooted in this idea that the Jewish people failed, that the Jewish people disowned Jesus, that the Jewish people rejected Jesus. But if you go back even to the book of Numbers and Deuteronomy, the majority has always rejected what God told us to do. It's the minority, which even in the days of Joshua and Caleb came down to 2 Jewish people. It's the smallest remnant that in the history of Israel, 2. But from that 2 and their children and their children's children, God continued to keep his promises. It's the story of Esther in the book of Esther when Haman tried to kill us and We won, so let's eat. Like, those are the things that we do when persecution comes. We keep pushing through. And the fact that we're still here is a reminder to people from every nation that when God makes a promise, he keeps it. And when God says, I'm going to bless, he does. And he blesses people who don't even call on his name. In some cases, are Jewish people who are atheists, which is a crazy concept. That Judaism, founded by God himself in a covenant with Abraham and later with Moses, that God creating this religious experience for Jewish people, for the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that somehow in 2020 there are people who claim to be Jews but are atheists, and God still blesses because the Jewish people are still his people. We're his firstborn son, and it's our responsibility to share that inheritance with the nations. Paul in Romans actually warned Gentile believers even before any of these things happened. He saw this all coming, and he says in Romans 11 specifically, he says in the text, I'm speaking to Gentiles here. Just want to be clear. I say then, Romans 11 and verse 11 to 15, I say then, did the Jewish people did not stumble so as to fall, did they? May it never be. But by their false steps, salvation has come to the Gentiles to provoke Israel to jealousy. Now, if their transgression leads to riches for the world, and their loss riches for the Gentiles, then how much more their fullness? Look, I'm speaking to you who are Gentiles, insofar as I am an apostle to the Gentiles, and I spotlight my own ministry if somehow I might provoke to jealousy my own flesh and blood and save some of them. For if their rejection, if the Jewish people's rejection leads to the reconciliation of the whole world, what will their acceptance be? But life from the dead. I mean, this is not just the story of Yeshua, who died and rose from the dead. This is the story of the history of the Jewish people, who often have been dead but came back to life. That should have been gone, like all of our enemies that are with us in the biblical text and in the ancient world, the Hittites and the Jebusites and the Elamites and the Assyrians and there's a big group, all these different groups of people who we have history of that we keep in museums, but they're not here. And even some of our enemies ancient enemies that are still here, like Egypt and Egyptians, are very diminished in their in world power, which actually the Bible says would happen. But the prophet said the Egyptians will stick around and they're going to have an inheritance as well, but they'll never rule and reign like they once did. And it comes back to this idea in Deuteronomy 26 that what God does for the Jewish people is he sets us high above all the nations. And he made us for praise, fame, and honor. Why? So that we could be a holy people to Adonai our God, as he promised us. And so that we could be a blessing to the nations. And so we continue to bless the nations, and Paul continues in verse 18 of Romans 11, and speaking to Gentiles, he kind of creates this analogy of these two olive trees. There's a natural olive tree, which is the Jewish people with the root and the fatness is God and Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the branches are the Jewish people. And then there's this wild olive tree, which he calls the Gentiles, and that a Gentile who believes in Jesus is a wild branch that's taken off that tree and put into the root and the fatness of the olive tree, along with Jewish people. But there's also these branches of Jewish people who have rejected God and are dead on the ground, laying dead branches. And Paul says to Gentiles, do not, verse 18 of Romans 11, do not boast against the branches. If you do boast, it's not you who support the root, but the root who supports you. It actually makes me think of the famous quote from Malcolm X. He said, the Plymouth Rock, we didn't land on Plymouth Rock landed on us. In the same way, he's saying, how could it be that there would be Gentiles who would come along who would think they are the root, and that the Jewish people are supported by that root rather than the opposite of it's not you who support the root, but the root that supports you. And you'll say then, branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in. True enough, Paul says. But they were broken off because of unbelief, and you stand by faith. Do not be arrogant, but fear, for if God did not spare the natural branches, the Jewish people, neither will he spare you. And then Paul says to Gentiles, he says, but notice then the kindness and severity of God. Man, this is a balance of two really amazing things. His kindness and his severity. His severity towards those who fell, but God's kindness towards you. Now, if you continue in his kindness, you continue in his kindness, otherwise you can be cut off also. And they also, the Jewish people, if they do not continue in their unbelief, but are grafted in, for God is able to graft them in again. For if you were cut out of that which by nature is a wild olive tree and grafted contrary to nature into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these natural branches be grafted into their own tree? David Stern famously says in Restoring the Jewishness of the Gospel, he says, for many Christians, the part of evangelism for Jewish people is now that you're a believer in Jesus, eat a ham sandwich. But that's not what Jewish people are supposed to do, because we have a unique covenant that God made with us as his firstborn sons to be a blessing to the Lord and to worship him and to be a blessing to the nations. And there are things that we are called to as a people that we should still observe, like the circumcising of our sons on the 8th day and the Sabbath and these wonderful holidays that we celebrate, the festivals of the Lord and kosher laws that are found in the text and all of these different things that are still ours because God made a covenant with my fathers. That Gentiles are then brought into the tree without necessarily having to observe these specific things. Some in our community and around the world feel like God has called them to who are not Jewish, and that's wonderful. But that's not the calling of all Gentiles. It's the calling of the Jewish people to be a light to the nations, and it's the calling from Romans 11, Paul's words, for Gentiles to provoke Jewish people to jealousy. How is it that there are Gentiles who know the God of Israel so well, who understand who he was and what he did? And it spurs people to jealousy. But how much more will these natural branches be grafted into their own olive tree? That as we see in modern Messianic Judaism over these last 60 years, we see Jewish people coming to faith in Yeshua and finding what it means to remain Jews while worshiping Jesus. You know, they catch a lot of flack back to the 70s for their ministry, but this is the idea of the name Jews for Jesus. We are Jews that are for Jesus because Jesus is for Jews. And the gospel is to the Jewish people first. And then it's our responsibility because of the inheritance given us by God to share that inheritance with the nations. I want to give you two amazing examples. If all of the Nobel Prizes and the science and the Einsteins and Seinfelds don't convince you enough. In 1886, the Statue of Liberty was erected in New York, in the New York Harbor. And originally, it had nothing to do with immigration. It was actually proposed by a French abolitionist who wanted the statue to commemorate the Union victory in the Civil War and the end of American slavery. And at the same time, in 1886, there was an influx of Jewish immigration from Russia, but also from the rest of Europe, to the United States. And among them was a young Jewish poet named Emma Lazarus. She was an activist and advocate for Jewish refugees fleeing persecution in Tsarist Russia. And she wrote the poem, The New Colossus. And it's found at the base of the Statue of Liberty. And it wasn't actually put there, it wasn't a part of the celebration when the statue was installed. But years later, actually she wrote it in 1883, and it was forgotten. And then they placed it years later, after her death, they placed it on a plaque in front of the statue, defining the statue to welcome immigrants from around the world to the United States. And you'll recognize at least some of it, but I'll read that poem to you, The New Colossus. Not like the brazen giant of Greek fame, with conquering limbs astride from land to land. Here at our sea-washed, sunset gate shall stand a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name, Mother of Exiles. And from her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome. Her mild eyes command the air-bridged harbor that twin cities frame. Keep ancient lands, you storied pomp, cries she with silent lips. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. And I lift my lamp beside the golden door. You can see there's some of these things in her imagery that come out of her understanding of being a Jew and from the scriptures. She refers to the Statue of Liberty as the mother of exiles, as the Jewish people have been exiled so many times. And from her hand, the torch glows this beacon that's like a light to the world to bring them. The twin cities she mentions in the poem at that time are actually Manhattan and Brooklyn. And the famous kind of part that we all know is give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning. But it's right from the Psalms where she says, I'll lift my lamp beside the golden door. And the Psalms say, your word will be a lamp unto my feet. And the golden door is Ellis Island, where so many immigrants came through. And so even symbols and the poems connected to those symbols in the United States are come out of a blessing that God put on the Jewish people that would understand what it is to be in exile and why people need a place to return. And actually, Emma Lazarus had very much on her heart and in her writings the idea. She was a Zionist before the land of Israel became a state, many years before. And it was the dream of her heart to see the Jewish people go back. But she looked at America as a place of safety while we waited for God to bring us back. Just this last week, Chadwick Boseman died. And Chadwick Boseman, who famously played Jackie Robinson in the movie 42. He played Thurgood Marshall in the movie Marshall, and then his biggest role was the Black Panther, the Marvel movie. It's this guy right here, actually. Why I'm wearing a Marvel shirt today. And one of the coolest things that happened, I think one of the coolest things that's happened in my life so far is Ibars was with me, and we were in Zimbabwe with Jewish Voice. And after the clinic was over, we went to a movie theater in the capital city of Harare. And it was one of the funniest scenes where they kind of lined everybody up in a kind of a weird way. It wasn't one person at a time. It was like a whole group at the door, and then they just flung the doors open. And of course, me being from New York and Ibars being a football player from New Jersey, we got in there first and kind of pushed through everybody to get in to get our seats. And we went to see the movie Avengers, the Avengers Infinity War. And one of the coolest things that I've really ever seen was a moment when the Black Panther first appeared on screen. And the majority of the room were Africans, Zimbabweans, and as they were watching and the Black Panther appeared, the entire place erupted in applause. It was just total joy and screams, and you couldn't even hear the parts of the movie that were happening, the dialogue, because the Black Panther appeared. And for the first time, it was a hero that represented them. And even not just a hero that represented Africans, but represented Africans in a positive light. And when you actually go back to the creation of the Black Panther himself, the Stan Lee and Jack Kirby put together this story. The first time he appears is in the Fantastic Four number 52 in July of 1966. And Stan Lee's was interviewed on a number of occasions and said, I didn't really have civil rights in mind. I just thought my black friends didn't have a black hero and I wanted to give them one. And what I noticed when Chadwick Boseman died is so many people, but particularly those from the African American community on Facebook and Instagram, were just in deep mourning at the loss. And in part, it was because of what this character symbolizes, to see themselves on a screen, to see a hero worth celebrating, and to lose an actor at a young age who represented that character so well was difficult. But it dawned on me that, Stan Lee is actually Stanley Martin Lieber, and Jack Kirby is actually Jacob Kurtzberg. And it's two Jewish guys who in 1966 created the first black comic book character. And it's almost as if for all of this time, even similarly to the story of the Statue of Liberty, for thousands of years, even Jewish people that don't follow God and claim to be atheists and have no religious leaning still create messiahs for other people. Like there's something in us as a people that are yearning for, in our hearts and in our minds and in our souls, I guess, like the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your strength. And it's out of those places where these Jewish artists and Jewish creators write some of the most amazing stories of messiahs who come to save people. And the way that people responded to Chadwick Boseman's death was the way that people respond to the death of a messiah. Because he's ours and he's special, and it was in a moment of time, and he was taken from us. But in the minds of these Jewish comic book writers, they really, when you go through the best stories of comic books, they're really just a retelling of good and evil, light and darkness. It's a retelling of God calling people back to himself. And even in kind of in the middle of all these things that are happening, it's these characters and these creations of Jewish people that are living out the promise of God that's because of him and comes from him. It's not because of us. And interestingly, it's where anti-Semitism plays into the opposite side, where people will say, why do Jews have to have so much praise and so much fame and so much honor? Why do they run Hollywood? Why do they, have a secret club to take over the world? And why do they gather together to do all these evil things when in reality, it's God blessing the people because he said he would, and not taking the blessing from us, but using the blessing to call his people back to himself. And in doing that, to call every person from every nation and every ethnicity and every culture and in every language to call back to himself, even through the stories of Jewish people who don't believe in God at all. And in some cases, people who fought against any religious aspect of being Jewish. But God is the one that gives us praise, fame, and honor so that we would be a holy people to the Lord, just as he promised, and so that in the Jewish people, all the nations of the earth would be blessed. He says to Israel, you are my firstborn son. And through my firstborn son will come my son, who will save the whole world. But even in the text of the Gospel of Matthew, in Matthew chapter 1, when they name Yeshua, in Hebrew it would say, and you will name him salvation, because he will save his people. But in English we read it as, you will name him Jesus, and he will save his people. But his name Yeshua means salvation, and to Jewish people and to his parents it meant, you're going to name him salvation because that's what he's going to do. He's going to save our people. He's going to call the Jewish people back to himself. And in calling the Jewish people back to himself, in the remnant that returns to him, he will use that remnant to call the nations back to himself. Because the covenant maker is a covenant keeper. First to the Jewish people, and then to every person from every nation who calls on the name of Yeshua. So we say, Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, my people, my firstborn son. And I see what's happening in our world today. I see in relationship with so many wonderful pastors and churches that are understanding the important role of the Jewish people, even today, not just the nation of Israel and the Jewish people as a whole, but even as Messianic Jewish brothers and sisters, that so many wonderful churches and pastors are supporting so many Messianic congregations and ministries because they're understanding the unique calling that God has never removed from his people, and the unique calling that we have to lead the nations to our God, because there's only one, and his name is Yeshua. And our responsibility as a people is to love him with all of our hearts, with all of our soul, and with all of our strength. And we're to talk about these things to our children and speak of them when we sit in our houses, when we walk by the way, when you lie down and when you rise up. You'll see it in movies, and you'll read it in magazines, and you'll see it in books, and you'll see it in music, and you'll see it all over in all of creation. You'll see, even with all the death that's happening and all the chaos that's happening in this world, there are these moments of light that happen because God is calling people back to himself. And we have an opportunity, those of us who are Jewish believers in Yeshua, to be a light to the nations. And those of you who are Gentiles, there is a gratitude to God for saving you through the story and the message of the Jewish people in the person of Yeshua. And there should be a love for Jewish people that's beyond just sending money to Israel or supporting the modern state of Israel, which I believe has some prophetic, is a fulfillment of prophecies. But the modern nation of Israel is not just the Jewish people. The Jewish people are everywhere. And God is calling us back to himself and reminding us, as he had to over and over again in the history of our people, you are my firstborn son, and you will bring blessing to all the nations, and I will give you praise, fame, and honor so that you would be a holy people. And in you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. I am evidence to you, as a Jewish follower of Jesus, that God keeps his promises. And because he keeps his promises to me and my people, he will always keep his promises to you and to anyone who calls on his name. Let me pray for you. Lord God, we thank you for who you are and who you've called your Jewish people to be, and who you've called your people from every nation who call on the name of Yeshua to be. Lord, we are so grateful that you never give up, that you never leave us, that you never forsake us, and that as many times as we have forsaken you, you still keep your promises to us. What a wonderful and amazing God that we serve. Pray these things in Yeshua's name. Amen. Next week, we're going to continue on the word Lord. Hear, O Israel, the Lord. Just who that is and what his name is and where his name comes from as we continue this series leading us in preparation to Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Sukkot. I love you. I'm so glad to spend some time with you today, and we'll see you next week.
May the Lord bless and keep you. May his grace and his face shine upon you. May the Lord lift up his countenance and give